I want to start by draining the oil. You can find your 15mm oil drain plug right at the back here next to the oil filter. Let's break this free. Remove it completely and make sure you have a collection bucket to catch all of the oil. I'm applying pressure on the drain bolt. That way when it gets to the end, it doesn't shoot out and make a mess everywhere. And when I feel that it's on the last thread, that's when I'm gonna let go. So right there, you can feel that as you unthread it, it skips on that last thread. So at this point, I'm just gonna pull it straight out, let all the oil drain. This is pretty much at its end. I'm gonna snug it up. All right, that's snug. I'm gonna get the torque wrench so I can torque it. 18 foot-pounds for this. Wipe off the drippage. Next, I'm gonna go ahead and remove this oil filter. That way we can get this out of our way. We'll just let this drain for a second. There we go. Let this all drain. And follow this up. You'll see the oil cooler lines right there. With a 10mm socket, unbolt these. Let this drain as well. Let's unbolt these lines with a 13mm socket. There we go. Next, we have to take out these two 15mm bolts. On the passenger side of the transmission, you'll see this bolt here, 10mm, that holds down a couple lines. Remove that. Make sure these can move around. And let's unplug this sensor. A pocket screwdriver or a pick. You can get to the connector here. Pry it up and back. That should pop this off. Now with a 10mm socket, let's go around and remove all the bolts that hold this oil pan up. Last bolt. Now that we have our oil pan on the workbench, we have to take off the gasket. But the gasket, if yours is still original, it's going to be riveted on. And you can see right here, this is one of the rivets. So all you need is a drill and a drill bit. We'll drill it out. Be careful. You don't want to make giant holes into your oil pan, obviously, but you do have to drill this out. Let's drill out the top of it. Okay, looks like it didn't take much. The rest of this you can punch out with a punch. There we go. And there is another one, which is on the opposite side, right there. We'll do the same thing to this one. I'm going to attempt to start with a larger drill bit first. We'll see if it works. Okay, there we go. Remove your old gasket and throw it away. Now we have to clean up this surface and of course inside of the oil pan. You always want to clean it up whether you have metal shavings, debris, or not. I'm going to start with the outer edge of it. I'm just going to take a razor blade and remove all of this junk that has accumulated over time. Scrape off any gasket material that might be left over. Now we are cleaning the inside of the pan, but try to scrape towards the outside just so you don't make more work for yourself. Try not to get it into the passageways here for the oil filter housing. We'll clean these off too, but obviously if you can avoid it, that would be best. I'm going to take this piece out just so I can clean better. 10mm socket. Now I'm going to go drain the leftover oil. I'll go to my parts washer and clean everything up. If you don't have a parts washer, you can just use brake parts cleaner and a bunch of rags and get everything cleaned up. Just make sure that you use lint-free rags, because you'll notice the inside of the oil pan is pretty rough. And if you use paper towels, they will most likely disintegrate and they'll get on the surface of the oil pan here, which is not good. I have my oil pan cleaned up. So let's put this back with the 4 10mm bolts. Make sure we snug those down. If you take this out and clean it, make sure you blow the holes out, because you don't want fluid getting stuck underneath the bolt, and then when you go to tighten it, it can potentially crack the aluminum. Just gonna double check on my hand to make sure they're actually nice and snug. Yep, perfect. And now, just like we did on the oil pan with a razor blade, I'm gonna go ahead and clean up the block surface. The cleaner you get it, the better the chance you have of not having a leak. Now with this cleaned up, I'm gonna degrease the surface with a rag and some brake parts cleaner on the rag to make sure that the gasket seals up perfectly. Now let's put the new gasket down, line it up with all the bolt holes, and obviously you don't have to rivet this. This is just for the factory so that they can have the gasket stay in place as the machines assemble the engine. However, you do need to put some gasket maker on some of the corners. You can see right here there are some hash marks. You just need to put a dab of RTV on here. There are 4 areas that this applies to. That's because there's a split in the engine block, and this gasket won't be enough to seal it. Less is more, so a dab, this is probably a little too much, I'll go ahead and wipe it off. A dab should suffice. Now bring the oil pan up with your freshly installed gasket. Try not to hit anything or pinch any wires or anything like that. Slide this up. It's always a good idea to have some bolts ready. All right, so I have this up. I'm gonna slide in these 2 rear bolts. Hopefully that holds the oil pan on for me while I get the rest of them. Now with the gasket lined up, I'm gonna slide this bolt through and thread it on. So this one's started. I'm gonna go and start one on each corner to hopefully situate the oil pan as evenly as possible. There we go, this one lined up. And if these 2 line up, then the rest of them will. All right, at this point I'm just gonna go ahead and start the rest of them in. Now I'm just gonna go in a cross pattern and bottom these out. I'm not tightening them, I'm just bottoming them out, and then we'll come around and torque them. More at the back here, the very long ones. And after we torque them, we'll tighten up the ones at the very back on the bell housing. I'm going to torque all these to 18 foot-pounds. And these 2 long ones get torqued to 106 inch-pounds. That converts to 8.8 foot-pounds. Be careful with these because due to their length, they can break easily. Now we can torque these 2 15mm bolts. 37 foot-pounds for these 2. I torqued my drain plug already at the beginning when I put it back in, and if you haven't, go ahead and do it now before it's too late. Now let's grab a gasket and the oil cooler lines. It's easiest if you put the bolts through the cooler adapter. It's easiest if you put the bolts through this plate and through the gasket and then line them up. This way everything gets held in place. Let's snug these down. Just make sure these are nice and snug. Now with this bracket lined up, I'm going to go ahead and put this bolt through. And with a 13 millimeter, just going to go ahead and snug this up. There we go. With every oil change, I like to prime the filter if possible. And this one is possible because it sits upright like this, so there's no way it's going to pour back out. So I'm going to take my 5W30 engine oil, that's what this engine takes, and I'm going to fill up this oil filter. This is going to allow it to basically be primed, ready to go, so the engine doesn't have to fill it up once it starts, and then it'll actually suck up oil right away as opposed to sucking up air. And I like to lean it to the side like this and just spin it around. That's going to get the oil flowing into the filter material, and I'm going to top it off as needed so it can be nice and full. Obviously don't go overboard, don't fill it up to the brim, but up to the top. It's going to bubble a little bit as the air comes out and the oil soaks in, but just give this a minute, and then while you wait, take a little bit of this oil, lubricate this gasket around the top. This is going to do two things. One, it's going to seal up better, and two, which is important, it's going to help it not stick onto the engine when you go to remove it next time. A lot of times these gaskets, especially if they're not lubricated, they will stick to the engine, and if you don't check that the old one comes off and you go to put the new one on, you're double gasketing it, and it's not going to make a seal. It's actually going to squish the old gasket out, and it's going to start shooting oil everywhere. So always double check that the old gasket is off and lubricate the new one. Go ahead and put the new oil filter on. And when you tighten it, don't tighten it with the oil filter wrench, just do it by hand. After it bottoms out, or once the gasket touches, usually go about half a turn, maybe 3/4 at most. But if you just make it tight by hand, that should be plenty right here. And definitely don't use an oil filter wrench to tighten it. Let's fill the engine up with oil, remove your oil fill cap, and as you can see, you need to use 5W30. Unless you typically use something else. But either way, let's put 6 quarts of 5W30. Because this is at a pretty severe angle, I don't want to spill anything, so I took a bottle, cut it, and that's going to make a little funnel for me to pour oil in. Like I said, we'll start with 6 quarts, and we'll measure after that's in. Now that the 6 quarts are in, I'm going to cap this off and check it on the dipstick, although it's not going to be completely accurate because we do need to start the engine first, but I want to get a baseline to make sure that it is somewhere between the low and the high marks. All right, so this is actually perfect. Not sure how well you can see it, but these dots, and on this side you have some hash marks, is this is the low line, this is the high line, and basically our oil is right above the high, which is okay because we haven't started the engine yet. So once we start it, it's probably going to go down. So I'm going to leave it exactly where it is. Stick this back in.